If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. This episode is about the need, nature, and development of thought tools. Kind of a weird term, maybe not familiar to you, but it means what you think it means. And this struck me because I was having a conversation with my daughter. And if you listen to the podcast, you know that my daughter is 23. She's beginning her career. She just graduated college, and she's trying to figure some things out. She's confronted with some new issues that really have become very prominent for her and very top of mind. And I think a lot of folks do that when they exit the structure of modern education. But we were talking about an idea, and she said, well, let me think about it. And in the moment, a couple of ideas struck me. The first, of course, is often when people say, let me think about it, I mean, I'll confess that I have used the phrase, let me think about it, as just to get off my back, a postponement kind of tool. I trust that I'm not totally unique on that front. So there's that whole category of let me think about it. But when we really want to think about something, and sometimes it's because we got the sense that we don't have a clear path forward. We don't have a clear yes or no on a question. Maybe there's a decision between options and we don't have a clear favorite choice. And we'll say, well, let me think about it. And my question is, when we say, let me think about it, what exactly are we going to do when we say that? What action do we, if I say, let me think about it, what action do I envision taking during this period of time? And this is assuming that it's not just a put off. Then what are we going to do to help us move forward in the situation? What are we going to do to make a decision? What are we going to do to make a commitment to some course of action out of multiple options? And this episode is going to be about that. I think it's an important topic. I certainly believe that we should consider before we take any course of action. But what are we going to do? What are we going to do practically to enact this need to think about it? And we'll talk about that. I worry that people, when they say, I need to think about it, they're going to ignore it until they're pressed for a decision, until the decision is unavoidable, and then they'll make a snap judgment. So I want us to think about it as knowledge workers. Think about what do we need to do? What are we practically going to do when we say, I need to think about it? And this is also sort of spurred by my last episode, which was about paper. And in that episode, I specifically talked about paper as this great mechanism for capture. And then I went on to say, we can use our computers in much the same way. And I think that's true. But I think that a lot of people also think it's a great thought tool, that paper is a great thought tool. And what I mean is people who really like journaling. I think using paper as a thought tool is one hypothesis for the value of journaling, and support for the people that love it. Yeah, it's a good tool for this kind of thing. And I believe it is. And I don't know if people are considering that when they consider the fact that they like to journal, but that may be a thing that's out there. Certainly with paper in the last episode, I talked about how when we get stuff out of our skulls, it provides some constraints. And they're fairly light, but the constraints are still there. Just having to use language, having to use writing, these kinds of ideas. And I think that those constraints help us structure our thinking about something. Those constraints help us structure our thoughts. And that led me to wonder, how else do we go about structuring our thoughts? Again, I would hate to think that when I say I'm going to think about it, it just means I'm going to go sit in a dark room somewhere for 20 minutes and consider the pros and cons. That would take a very highly skilled, highly trained mind to sit there. And if you think, well, I'm going to organize my thoughts, then what action are you going to take to organize your thoughts? And this goes back to this, I think, kind of mushy thinking process that we have in our brains. And I covered this last episode, but I believe our brains are very, very useful, terribly valued. They're brilliant, right? Pieces of equipment. But I do think things are a little mushy there. I think things are not often crisply formed in our brain. And one way to deal with that is to get them out into some physical medium. And that was all the last podcast. And then I look at the situation for knowledge workers and I think about Peter Drucker's question. So, Peter Drucker, if you've listened to the podcast, you've heard his name before. He wrote about the management challenge of the 21st century. And his question was, okay, what are we going to do about the productivity of knowledge work? So we spent the 20th century improving the productivity of manual labor, in my mind, largely by substituting robots for it. But in order to keep the growth in our standard of living, and this is Drucker saying this, we have to continually improve the productivity of our assets. And now that we're in a knowledge work world, we want to improve the productivity of our mental assets. How do we do that? Well, I mentioned before the idea of a thought tool. I don't think it's a unique idea. And by thought tool, all I really mean, just to get some clarity here, all I really mean is some structure, some way to enlarge on our thought or make our thought different or bring in other thoughts, some way to activate our brain around a concept, some way to, really get our thinking going in different ways. And I'll talk a little bit more about this notion of ruminating on it. And I think that's can be very useful. I'll talk about that in a minute. As I said, knowledge work is mushy. So what can we do to make it more concrete? So we'll think it through together on this episode. But I think that developing thought tools is a way to make progress against Drucker's question. So if we think about thought tools and some of the situations where we're having to think and consider, many cases spring to mind. Is it done? Is my work done? Is there some tool or structure that can help us with that thinking? Because otherwise we perhaps fall into perfectionist thinking. And of course it's not done because it's not perfect. I can still see the flaws. Well, there's a point at which, diminishing returns. When we make decisions around which option to pursue, say in a business, and we'll dig into this case as well, but we really want to have a clear tool set for thinking through this. And ideally, it would be a repeatable tool set. So we'll talk specifically, I'll spend a I'll spend several minutes on the notion of decision making as an area of thought, and then wondering what our thought tools are around. Now, many professions have thought tools, and you may not consider them as a thought tool, but I think they qualify. If you think about accountants, they have thought tools, they have spreadsheets, and they have forms that they fill out, and they have these structures that are commonly used to evaluate the financial well-being of an entity. You may argue that some of their measures are not right or perfect or whatever, and that's an open debate as far as I'm concerned. But they do have these ways to structure their thinking about a company. Architects use drawings and blueprints and structured ways. They'll even do modeling, both in 3D, and I distinctly remember a time when they would make it out of foam board. They'd make their models. I'd imagine most of it is 3D rendered pictures now. But they have these tools. Engineers, typically engineers have great thought tools in terms of models and physical properties of things and equations that they'll use. Certainly any modeling tool is a thought tool. People who draw sketches of their thought, maybe a clothes designer here. Architects fall into the same thing. And artists may do this as well before they get out their paints and their canvas. They are often sketching what it is they want to draw so that they can think more clearly about, say, the composition of the picture or something like that. And so I think these things exist. I'm not sure that they're under practical development. I'm not sure that people are sitting out there going, we need a new thought tool for, let's say, dentists. Well, maybe you do, and maybe you don't, maybe there is, and maybe there isn't, but I'm not sure that somebody's out there thinking about this. And I'll do some further research, but right now I just want to motivate us in the use and development of thought tools. And there are people out there that are trying to help us with some thought tools, but I think in many cases, we're probably maybe left to our own devices on this front. Now, there's one other case of let me think about it. And that's, I use the term percolate. And what I mean by percolate, it's well known in mental studies that your brain will work on a problem even if you're not aware that your brain is working on a problem. It's subconscious, right? It's percolating. It's this passive kind of think about it. And I think these processes are great. But I believe we want to steer away from just ruminating on a problem. And ruminating means, as you well know, it means just turning it over and over in your head. Ruminating to me is way too close to worry to be an effective tool. And I do think that the science on this subconscious thinking says a lot about you want to structure the problem pretty clearly before you hand it off to your subconscious. And I believe that problem framing is the home of thought tools. It's a way to structure the problem, get it out there in the world, and actively have something to do, something practical to do while we're thinking about it. I would suggest that a thought tool is probably associated with a process, meaning that there's some set of steps that we go through that we can record and commonly use and get back to. And this would constitute a thought tool, a thinking process. And I think we're seeing some areas of this in the decision-making literature. And as I said, I'll get to that in a few minutes. So thought tools, I think we can use them easily and effectively. I think we can extend their development, particularly within a profession. I think this is valuable in the sense that it should help knowledge workers be more productive. That's easy to presume because if a tool doesn't make us more productive, then we're going to stop using it. But I do think that there's opportunities for us to do that. And then to bring that out and expand on it outside of an individual profession, out into knowledge work and the thought world generally. Academics have some thought tools that they use. And I think a lot of that is this idea of referring to the work of other people. And it helps to structure your thinking because how does it situate itself in amongst competing ideas? And that really helps you say, well, it's not this because of this thing, and it's not that because of this other thing, which beats the heck out of saying, well, it just feels different. Okay, so we'll run through some examples of generalized thought tools here. I mentioned journaling earlier. I think it definitely falls under the heading of a thought tool, whether it works for you or not. I think it's acceptable in the definition of a thought tool. And as I mentioned in the last episode, I think any structure will help us clarify our thinking. And if we're just jotting down ideas on a piece of paper, then we're utilizing the structure of the English language. And I go back to programming days when I was a programmer. And I think this is a pretty common story if you talk to programmers, particularly in the old days before the internet. We would run up against a problem and we would think about it for a little while, and then we habitually would go pester each other about this problem. And hey, or at least I would, hey, can you help me think this problem through? And the funny part is, by the time I got up from my desk and walked over to where the other programmer might be or found somebody, whatever it was, just the act of preparing my thought as a question would often answer it. Many times it's you walk up to, your friend or whoever, your coworker, and you go, oh, I just figured it out, never mind. And so then you go back to your desk and you implement the code. Well, what's the magic there? Is it just time? I tend to think it was phrasing the thought in such a way as to make somebody else understand where you are. And then a lot of times, if you can do that, then it's, oh, well, the answer is pretty clear. And so I think that structuring piece is very important. Now, in journaling, maybe there's some ways to enhance the tool. A lot of writing about what do I think? Well, maybe there's some structured questions that you would want to put into your journaling for specific situations. And I'll have an example of that when we get to the decision-making process, a way to look at a common decision from a different perspective. But another way to structure some journal questions is, okay, well, what would person X do in this situation? Maybe your hero. I've been learning bass, and a lot of learning bass is I've got 6 or 8 bass players that are in my mind sometimes, and I think, well, if I was going to play this bass line, what would person X do? What would they play? And that just helps to give some structure and some different thinking. How would I explain this problem to another human being? And so I think these things could add into journaling as a thought tool. I think there's a very underestimated thought tool that's used to be terribly common and now is less common, and that is read about it as a thought tool. Read about your question. And it doesn't have to be going to look up the answer because you may not know how to do that. Of course, we've got Google. But again, looking at similar questions and the way other people have phrased the question, whether they've answered it or not. Reading has this property of centering your thinking on a subject. And this may be another aspect of journaling where you write out your thoughts and then you set it aside and then you come back to it later in the day or tomorrow and you read what you were thinking. And that just gives you a little bit of a different perspective on the situation. But I think reading as a thought tool, as compared to reading for pleasure or reading just for entertainment. Back in historical times, people thought that a well-educated person just had to read these 100 books. And if they got through them, then they go start over and read the first one again and just constantly have these ideas in their minds. And I think that's a hint as to the notion of reading as a tool to help us think our own thoughts. One of my favorite computing tools is spreadsheets. And I think spreadsheets are a thought tool. I think spreadsheets help us structure certain kinds of problems so that we're forced to clarify what we think. I also love spreadsheets. My tendency is, since I'm a computer guy, my tendency is instead of lighting up the calculator app, I'll light up a spreadsheet. Now, many times, well, one thing is I'm pretty good at basic arithmetic. Just, I don't know. Anyway, so I can do some things in my head. So if I need an instrument, it's probably not what's 8 times 8. It's probably a more involved calculation than that. And the great thing about putting calculations in a spreadsheet is that you have a much better chance to error correct. You put them in a calculator, even a memory calculator. You put them in a calculator and they more like disappear after you've entered them. And ooh, did I hit a plus there or a minus? And you can do this, you can do similar things at a similar speed, at least for me, in Excel spreadsheets, but I've done a lot of spreadsheet work. So it's sort of, I know very well how the tool works. Not that I'm some great, the edges of what Excel can do, but just for standard run of mill stuff, I'm pretty good. But instead of whooping out your calculator, whoop out a spreadsheet and then put all the numbers in there and then do the math on them. You can do math on subparts of it, and it's really an entertaining way in my mind to do math. But it's a good thought tool because it helps you easily correct mistakes, and B, it brings these numbers to life in a more permanent and different way. And a lot of times I'll be doing a calculation and I'll go, well, I put a 60% chance in there. What makes me believe that it's a 60% chance? Is there any data? Oh, well, and then I go look and it's like, oh no, this is a 95% chance. Oh, that made my decision a little easier. But it helps to show us our assumptions in some ways. So, and again, just thinking through generalized thought tools. I don't think these are foreign things. I think me calling them thought tools might be a little foreign to you, but we do use them in more or less an automatic way. I think on the subject of Excel, I think numeric thought tools are very, very useful because numbers crystallize things and numbers don't allow for mushiness. If there's a 60% chance of rain and a 50% chance that you bring your umbrella, what's the odds that you're going to get wet? Well, that's pretty easy to do in the math world, but it's hard to do because most people say, well, 50%. No, the odds of you getting wet are more like 70% if you do 60 and 50. And so I think in just those ways, it clarifies. So lots about numeric thought tools. There's this really interesting part. One of my favorite books is Annie Duke's Thinking in Bets. And she tells a story about professional poker players who, instead of having an argument, yes, you will, no, I won't, they habitually calculate some odds and throw out a wager. So if somebody says, her example, I think in the book is one of the guys was going, you know what, I'm gonna, they all lived in New York or something. You know what, I'm gonna move to Vegas. And his buddy's like, oh, you'll hate it in Vegas. You won't last a year. So, well, I think I like Vegas. And so immediately they moved to a bet. And one of the guys says, I'll bet you $100,000 that you won't stay in Vegas for a full year. And that then puts some structure around the problem. Because now you're thinking, okay, well, what would it take for me to be happy in Vegas? Could I be happy with another $100,000 at the end of the year, or is that not enough money? And really just positions it somewhat differently and helps you inspect it from a different direction. There's a book by Daniel Levitin. It's called The Organized Mind, and that's another book that I recommend. He, in the closing chapters of his book, he talks about a thought tool for medical decisions that takes into account the efficacy rate and the side effects. And he talks about a way to structure this thinking. He doesn't say, here's what you do. He just puts a tool in your hands to be able to use as you're walking through this. That's a thought tool. Certainly financial modeling qualifies as a thought tool. It's much more clear when we think in options. And I'll get to more of this later. But we use thought tools. And I think if we can consider our thought tools and maybe spend a little bit of time trying to make better use of them, which may mean more frequent use of them, or refining them in some ways, I think we'll begin to be better at knowledge work, at thinking through our stuff. And so there's some examples that we already do this. So this is not a totally foreign concept. Of course, one of the big areas where we think about it is when we actually have a decision to make. And there's been some good work on decision making, and both personal and group decision making. I would say the majority of the work has been in group decision making because that's a little easier to see. There's a book by Chip and Dan Heath called Decisive, and they make great hay out of the fact that you should have a decision making process. And I absolutely agree with this, particularly in the group world. You should have a process. And there may be 2 or 3 different processes depending on the kind of decision you have to make. But they really help us understand the notion of having a process. And again, I'll go back to Annie Duke for some support on this. And this, of course, is back to thinking in bets. Because she talks about an error that poker players make. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts, but I'll make sure that it's clear enough. So, poker is a series of decisions. Do I take cards? How many do I take? Do I bet here? Do I not bet here? If I decide to bet here, how much am I going to bet? What's the right amount for a bet? All of these decisions. So, what happens, she says, sometimes to poker players is they make a decision to bet and then they lose the hand. Now, in poker, you can almost always lose a hand. It doesn't matter how good your cards are. Luck sometimes favors the other player. But she makes the point that you can make a proper, right, correct whatever word you want to use, decision and still lose. She talks about how poker players fall prey to what she calls resulting, which is, well, if I got a bad outcome, it must have been a bad decision. And particularly in poker, that's simply not true. It's a very statistical game and there are odds and things, but you can make a good decision and still lose. And that's her point. So her further point is don't automatically restructure your decision-making process off of one case where you made this decision and you wound up losing. And so then thinking back into our decision-making processes, when you think about whether or not you made a good decision, I think there's an argument for, well, yes, it was a good decision because we followed our decision-making process. And so that's a valid reason to have a process, is so that you can follow it. And so decisive is very much about that. And an example of a thought tool from decisive, and this is an abstract thought tool. They talk about the notion of, well, should we do this or not do it? Should we make this investment or not make it? And from their perspective, that's a bad question for us to ask ourselves. It opens us up to psychology, our own strengths and weaknesses. If you're a type A, take action kind of person, then you're more likely to say, well, let's do it. In the vein of, well, something is better than nothing. And so these whether or not questions, and they say the tool, the tactic here is to clearly frame the other side of the question. And I'll give you an example. If you're considering an investment in a new piece of equipment, and the question surfaces as, hey, should we buy this piece of equipment or not? The or not side of the question is very mushy. And so beginning to structure that other side of the question, an easy way to do that is, well, the tool's going to cost us, the machine's going to cost us $250,000. Should we buy it or not can easily resolve into, should we spend $250,000 on this machine or should we spend it somewhere else? And just as an example of the power of this kind of thing, that immediately brings up the question of, well, do we have $250,000 to spend on innovation kinds of projects? Maybe you do, maybe don't. Maybe you've already considered that. But that's one of the ways that framing then helps you think more clearly and concretely about these ideas, these situations, options. And so instead of asking whether or not questions, we want to structure it more as a decision between two positive courses of action. Even if it's just, well, yes, we have $250,000. If we spend it on this machine, we won't have it. If we don't spend it on this machine, we'll put it in a bank investment and make 3% a year on it. Okay, even that helps structure the decision to some degree. So as we're looking into these tools, it's very interesting because one of the great things about tools, and people go, well, I don't need to use a tool. I'd rather rely on my feelings. Okay, you can still rely on your feelings, even if you use a tool. Even if the tool says, oh, yes, you should do this, that doesn't mean you have to do it. So sometimes a process will bring out a clear decision and you still don't want to do it. You still think it's wrong for some reason. Well, even that will help you clarify your thoughts. So this whole process piece, particularly in a group, They talk about another group decision-making process, and they say, well, don't have a 2 hour long meeting just to discuss an idea. You can put more structure on it than that. So if you're the boss and you're getting your team together to figure out where to have the company Christmas party or the departmental Christmas party, whatever, and you just get together and talk about it, that's going to be the result is going to be mushy. People are going to bring up things you hadn't thought about, and they're going to bring in a whole bunch of potentially extraneous information, what have you. And so they suggest that you pick two teams, and one is in favor of one of the options and the other is in favor of the other option. Or if it's actually a binary choice, then there's a pro team and a con team. And you nominate the teams and you say, okay, here's the team you're on, and it doesn't matter what their opinion is. In fact, it's very helpful for somebody to be in favor of the decision to live on the team that has to present the against the decision position. That sharpens up that team's thinking. And then we'll get back in a week. We'll do 30-minute presentations. The pros or the in favor of option A people will present, and the in favor of option B people will present, and then we'll make a decision through some mechanism. So all of these ideas help us to think. Now, I will say, in my mind, the decision-making processes are in some ways a subset of the larger class of thought tools. I think it's great to have a process. I've told the story a few different times of the estimation process in programming. So the way programming works is you divide stuff up into pieces and you hand a piece to somebody and you say, okay, how long will it take you to do that? And they come back with some number of hours or days or weeks or whatever it is. And I always required the programmers on my teams to have some sort of process for arriving at an estimate. And I didn't even care what their process was. But having a process allows you, in many ways, allows you to learn. And here's the picture. I'm sure I've told this story before. I don't care if you roll goat bones to figure out how long it's going to take you to program something. Because if you roll the goat bones and you come up with a number and your number is not the actual number, right? So you roll the goat bones say 3 days. When you actually do it, it takes you 6. So what are you now going to do with this new data? You're going to build it back into the goat bones. And you're going to say, well, I used to divide the goat bones by 2, but now I'm not going to do that because I'm off. And I'm going to improve the process over iterations. The standard tactic for estimating is to look wise for about 10 minutes and then pop up with some sort of quasi-random answer. 4 days. And there's no way to adjust that process. There's no way to ingrain the learning if you're wrong. And so thinking through having a process, because if nothing else, if you make a bad decision, you can go back and review your process. And you can say, well, by bad decision, I of course mean if you decide something that turns out to not be what you thought it was, then you can go back and you can review your decision-making process and say, gee, is there some way we can improve this process? Is there some way this process could be changed to incorporate the kind of data that we found out after the fact? And so having that process, I think, is very important to record and to activate the learning that we get through. And the bottom line, and this is back to Drucker's question, the bottom line is, as knowledge workers, we think for a living. in much the same way that a tennis player swings a tennis racket for a living. It's what we do, we think. And that was the title of a book by Thomas Davenport, maybe 20-ish years ago, Thinking for a Living, which I thought was a good book, but didn't do well. Tennis players hit tennis balls for a living, so they work a lot on becoming better at hitting tennis balls. And I want knowledge workers to adopt that same stance. I want myself as a knowledge worker to adopt that same stance. And how can I get better as a knowledge worker? How can I get better doing what I do? And we'll talk about that, but then that goes back to Drucker. Better, one notion of better is more productive. More productive can be faster. More productive can be less error prone. All kind of different ways to be more productive. And the whole notion of tools for this. Man, the tool maker. That's what we do, is we make tools that help us. And so if we're able to do that in our knowledge work, then the idea would be that that's an opportunity for help in what we do. So let's roll it all the way back. We talked about a lot of things. So we've talked about thought tools as this category of things, and the definition is still not abundantly clear, but it's sort of clear. These are the things that we use to help us think. A computer should be a thought tool. Help me think. I don't know that we have used it that way, but that's an episode 3 or 4 episodes ago where I talked about what difference has computing made in your life. I think in most cases, the computer has only actually made it easier or faster to do what we already do. And I'm not saying that doesn't have any value. I'm just saying it would be nice if it, instead of helping us do what we do faster, if it helped us do what we do better. And granted, faster is often a component of better, but not always. We roll back again to our initial question. You say, hey, I'm going to think about it. You either say it to another person or you say it to yourself. Let me think about this. What are we actually going to do to think about it? Do we have a process? Do we have a tool that we go back to? Journaling, I think, is fairly rudimentary, but probably works and can be easily improved, like we talked about with your journal might include 4 or 5 different sheets of questions that you'll answer in different scenarios. Well, this is a relationship question. Let me answer this set of questions while I'm journaling. Well, this is a financial issue. And have that. And that way you can develop a process which has all the good features that we talked about. It gives you confidence in your decision. It gives you something to go back to and incorporate learning and data. And it helps you define what a good decision is. So looking into process, looking into habitual use of thought tools, looking into categorizing them as thought tools, and trying to think of ways to improve them in your own world. As a takeaway, I will say that attention compass is intended to be a thought tool. It's intended to be something that helps knowledge workers deal with information. It's focused on the decision making around what to do and when to do it, around tasks. It's focused around, can I put my attention here and expect it to stay here? Those kinds of ideas. So it's a thought tool in the sense of structure as compared probably to the sense of a tool as enhancing our capabilities. It has a couple of smaller thought tools built into it. We make a big deal out of the process of capture and the process of processing. And as I've alluded to before, I think the mere act of capture, of getting our ideas out of our skull, out into the world, gives us some useful constraints so that we think about it. Also, during the processing step in attention compass, we actually have a thought tool, and that thought tool is, okay, what's the very next step? What's the first thing I can do to act on this task? Write that down, and it clarifies what we're doing. I've talked about procrastination as an act of uncertainty. I've talked about procrastination as seemingly it's our brains don't know what to do. And so, given that they're brains, if they don't know what to do, they do nothing. When we walk through these ideas, then that helps us. In the case of attention compass, it helps us with our tasks and information. You get a new piece of information, you spend a minute thinking, what kind of information is this and what value does it have in my life? And that again is this generic, fairly lightweight thought tool. So we're engaging information with our brains rather than just rote memorizing it. And I don't know, memorizing may be another good thought tool. Certainly come from a Christian spiritual background and am a Christian. And people say great things about memorizing scripture as a thought tool. So you kind of always have it in your head. I think there's some ancient wisdom to that. Because what we think about becomes what we do and who we are. So, got a little deep there all of a sudden. Sorry about that. But attention compass includes some thought tools, fairly rudimentary, lots of writing things down, lots of, hey, what is this thing? What do I do about it? And clarifying as a way to help us move through our days. I would say if you're interested in attention compass from that aspect, I would suggest that you might want to listen to a few episodes that now are a little ways back in the archive. I did a 3-part series on attention compass and what it is and how it works. That would be episodes 22, 23, and 24. So you may want to go back and give those episodes a listen as you search for thought tools to apply. One of the problems with thought tools is different tools apply in different situations. And the more specific the situation is, the easier it is to find a tool that will do it. Knowledge work is this abstract, generalized process. And so it's only fair that right now our tools are abstract and generalized as well. But I do think if we focus, if we start thinking about this, then I think we can make improvements in our use of thought tools. And I would definitely avoid waiting around for somebody else to hand you a thought tool. Develop some of your own and try them out. See if they give you benefit, if they make you more confident, if they give you a place to record data about a decision that you consistently make. How can I think about it? Well, get out a tool and commence to thinking. Shape your thoughts in different ways. And I think this will be very helpful for all of us as knowledge workers and will help us approach Peter Drucker's question that I mentioned earlier. So go out and take a look at Attention Compass, take a new look at Excel, take a new look at journaling, all of these different things. So if we can categorize them in our own minds as thought tools, then I think that will help us use them. And I think it will definitely help us improve our own thinking. As always, I published some thoughts about this episode on LinkedIn. If you're not following me on LinkedIn, you may want to do that just so you can see me think about these podcast episodes and contribute to them, if that's what you want to do. Certainly, questions and thoughts are always welcome. If you don't want to do it publicly, you can email me, Larry at dobusywrite.com. Let me know that you listened to the podcast and you've got a thought. I'd love to hear that from you. And certainly a very simple takeaway here is to go back to the website. All the podcast episodes are on the Do Busy Write website, dobusywrite.com. And there's an archive, and you can go in and find episodes 22, 23, and 24, where I talk about attention compass and what it does and why it's important to do things in these ways. And I think if you look at attention compass from a thought tool perspective, you'll understand what I mean as it being this generic thought tool. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Write podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Write.